Welcome to Build Your Dream Network. I'm Kelly Hoey. I see people struggling to connect effectively all the time, so I created this podcast to help you master your network building needs. Whether you're seeking a new job, looking for a promotion, or scaling your business, you need a network, and you're in the right place to get the advice you need. And don't worry, my advice is real, it's actionable and practical because it's the advice I follow and is what has transformed my career from the traditional to the unexpected. So let's get started. This week on the podcast, I am thrilled to welcome Heidi Moore. She is a digital media advisor consulting media companies and startups on journalism. She has had an incredible career as a journalist and editor. She's launched business and personal finance sections for The Guardian in the U.S., was New York bureau chief for Marketplace Radio, a reporter at the Wall Street Journal covering investment banks during the financial crisis, a personal favorite time of mine as a former bankruptcy attorney.
Good times.
Good times. She was also former editor-in-chief and co-founder of Ladders, the first publication dedicated to careers and the future of work. She's a native New Yorker. And I'm giving you all that background because, maybe some of you do know her from on Twitter. And she is at MooreHN. I just got to check that again, MooreHN. Heidi, thanks for coming in.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So we're going to talk about the inverted yield curve and trolls. And I'm probably sure people are thinking, what has this got to do with networking? Mm-hmm. And what this has to do with networking, for those listening, is you have taken a platform which so many people confuse its use. They think it's marketing or just sort of spewing. You have really used it in a way to convey complex issues. And, that's one of your superpowers, I think, is to concisely and accurately explain things. But talk about how you're using Twitter in explaining some of those complex issues like the inverted yield curve.
Sure. And I'm glad I don't have to talk about my other superpowers because I signed NDAs about all of those. But in terms of Twitter, I think that there are two ways to approach it. And it's really interesting how using Twitter as a networking tool, as a way to connect with other people, has really changed from the beginning. So I've been on it since 2009. I think you've been on it also relatively early since the beginning, and it's changed a lot since then. So one thing that hasn't changed is that the resistance to it is still a diminishment of what the platform can do, right? So people don't think that Twitter can do anything, that it's just this giant video game like a live AOL chat of some kind, and that it has no real value. And so, to kind of step back from that, that's the first barrier that a lot of people have to connecting online. And there are limits to connecting online. But the first thing to overcome is there's an amazing quote, I think it's by Raymond Carver, and I keep it by my desk everywhere I go. And it says something like, if Shakespeare were alive today, he would not have said this medium is not good, right? He would have written and directed plays, movies, Netflix. He didn't say Netflix, but anything like that. He would have taken the medium and he would have made it good, right? And so when you're looking at Twitter, you have to look at it as not something that is 240 characters, that is a one-way broadcast to other people. You can see it as a very brief and concise way to express a thought that people may or may not respond to. And then if they engage, you can see whether to go on. Some people go on anyway. And frequently I often do when I'm really on a rant. But so the idea is that the medium itself can be useful if you make it useful, right? Everything is useful if you make it useful. And I think that the other thing about Twitter is that by being concise, and this is something that I learned from working in radio. I was a print reporter, digital reporter, and editor before I moved into radio, and I didn't want to do it. But they said, we think you'd be good at this. And I said, I'm really afraid of buttons. And radio seems like it has a lot of buttons, so why would I do that? And they talked me through it. But the real virtue of being exposed to other media, which we now all are, right? Now we can tweet, we can make our own videos, we make our own podcasts. Like, we have all become very skilled at integrating visual media with print media, with audio, with video in ways that our ancestors certainly could have never pictured. And so to bring that back to where Twitter becomes useful is what it does is that it gives you the opportunity to say what you want to say in a very concise and direct way without dancing around it. And if you can make the most of that, and you can respect that opportunity, then you really can connect with people, right? Knowing a subject, this is what we know, because you're an expert too on finance and all of that. What we know is that even in really complicated areas like finance, medicine, so on, the people working in different functions in those areas don't all know the full picture, right? So for instance, in finance, and this is limiting, so I apologize to anybody who may not be familiar, but there are traders who trade bonds and stocks. There are investment bankers who advise companies and work with CEOs. They are totally different people, totally different personalities, and they have no idea what the other really does, right? And so you have to talk at a level that unites even the experts, and that's often as well as the layman. And so while there are people who like to engage in jargon because it shows they're inside the club, that they are knowledgeable, all that really does is actually lock out not just the layman, but even the experts. So if you can talk to the quote-unquote layman, which is all of us, then it shows you really know your subject. You're inviting people in, and you're also welcoming people who know the subject as well. So you're really creating a much bigger expansion for sharing ideas. And if you're not on social media to share ideas, then why are we there?
I was sort of thinking as you were talking, as soon as you said, being an expert and the narrowness of it, having both practiced banking and solvency law when I was in Canada, but more importantly, when I was in New York, here in New York and practicing law, doing commercial mortgage-backed securities. And people would say, I need to ask you a legal question, Kelly. And I'm like, you don't understand. I know this very narrow slice of New York, U.S. law. This is all I focus on, this very slim little piece of law. This is what I do. I was also thinking when you were talking, the whole idea of when people say, well, the platform doesn't work for me, rather than saying, how am I working with this platform? We're all given the same way to log on to Twitter. We're all given the same way to create our profile. We're all given, 240 characters, or 280. How many do we have? 240, 280? I can't, here it is. I try and use fewer. We're all given the same thing, but how we use it, how do you bring your humanity, how you bring your personality, really makes all the difference.
Yeah, and it's going to have flaws, right? It is a scratch pad of sorts. You can't put a full thought into 240 characters, or even if you use the mode that a lot of people use on Twitter, which are called threads, where you just link several thoughts together. There's always going to be a limit to that. But if you see the virtue in the limit, and if you take people's feedback and then keep building on it, then you create something that can reach a lot more people than, for instance, in my business, an article or a video. And it can reach people who may not have a subscription to your publication, who may not know your name. It's just, I like the freedom of it. And there is an element of chaos, a very big element of chaos to it. But, it's lovely. Like I was thinking, when we were talking about having this conversation, if anyone has ever been injured, as I frequently am, as I am a klutz, if you ever do physical therapy, they teach you something called proprioception, right? And so proprioception is physically knowing where your body is in space relative to other people, relative to other objects, right? And so if you have good proprioception, you're not bumping into things, right? You know where people are. And I think the one virtue of social media is I think it teaches us a digital form of proprioception. Right, it teaches us who's behind us, who's next to us, who's in front of us. Like we become a little bit more careful about the movement, or the waltz, if you will, of being invited into other people's ideas and other people's spaces, right? And so you can go ahead and run in like a bull in a china shop, as we know some people do on Twitter, some people in very prominent political positions currently. But for the most part, it can be, if we choose to take it, an education in compassion and empathy and seeing other worlds. But it does take as well, just like proprioception, a lot of discipline to learn, right? And not all of us have mastered it. God knows I work at it all the time.
Well, it's human. I think it gets back to it's human relationships. This is another venue to connect and network and engage with other human beings, not, a random avatar and all that kind of stuff. But we will get to trolls in a minute. I want to go back to the inverted yield curve. Talk, for anyone who hasn't seen that thread, talk about how you shared a very complex subject in a thread on Twitter.
Sure. I was astounded by the reaction. So for people who aren't familiar with the inverted yield curve, it's an element in economics, which is the study of how the U.S. economy or the world economy is going. And it takes a look at very specifically the interest rates of Treasury securities, which are the securities issued by the U.S. government. And what it does is that it takes how these rates change and it predicts whether we'll have an economic recession. So it is a very narrow, jargony sort of indicator of a future recession. A lot of economists and journalists and pundits debate it all the time. It is not something, in finance in general, is not something in a world where other people are invited to, which is constantly to my irritation, right? So if I have a mission in life, it is, or in my career rather, it is to invite people into the world of money and finance in a way that they understand that being a financial citizen is as important as being a civic citizen, right? So if you vote, then you are voting on a social system that's affecting how you live. We don't vote on our money. We're taught that we have no vote there, right? We don't have good rights from banks, and yet it is money that determines who our friends are and where we live and how we're educated and where we eat and when we eat and how often we eat. So all of these things in our lives are determined by money, but for a lot of people, it's a very fearful subject, right? It's nervous. It's something people associate with bills and debt and never getting ahead and never quite understanding.
And things those money guys on Wall Street look after for us.
Yes. And actually, there's somebody I know on Twitter who was really funny. I was once ranting about how, there are key differences between all the jobs in finance, right? And he was, and people call everyone an investment banker, right? Which is just a term that is very specific and does not apply to everyone. And somebody suggested the term money workers, which I really love and I still use. That shout out goes to Jacob Harris on Twitter. And so, to the point about the inverted yield curve, it seemed like an opportunity to maybe invite a few more people into this debate about something that could predict a recession, which affects all of us. I think all of us understand a recession is widely applicable. The inverted yield curve, less so. So I just wrote a tweet, does anyone want to know about the inverted yield curve? If so, I'll do a thread. I thought 5 people would say yes. I was going to do this thread anyway, right? And then it ended up going viral. Like 30,000 people liked it and shared it. I was astounded. I had no idea how this could happen. All I did was break it down in very, very simple terms that, when people on Wall Street think that a recession is coming in 2 years, they buy certain kinds of Treasury securities. If they think it's coming in 10 years, they buy other kinds of Treasury securities. That's the whole secret. And so by watching the 2 prices of those Treasury securities, you understand what the U.S. is going to look like, according to Wall Street opinion, in 2 years and in 10 years.
But you made a lovely Well, first off, the fact that you actually said, and I remember the initial tweet, and it was this very I've got some ideas and some thoughts and ways of talking about the inverted yield curve. Does anyone want to hear me share it? The fact that you sort of did it as an invitation, like, hey, anyone, and that just it sounds so funny, the warmth in that initial tweet. But then you made a great analogy in there, as I recall, in terms of when you were discussing the inverted yield curve, that made it so approachable to anyone who was not in finance.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to recall it right now, but I think that to the warmth and to the metaphors.
Was it different, short stories, and there was something.
Oh, where novels and short stories.
Yes, now since we're sitting in Penguin Random House, I was like, I think
right.
It had to do with novels. The difference between a novel and a short story.
Yes. So to anyone who doesn't know, who's listening to the podcast and doesn't know, we're in the Penguin Random House headquarters, and the lobby is this beautiful soaring space that's filled with ancient books and modern books alike. Everything from Henry of Navarre to there was a book on Satan, which I thought was an interesting choice for a lobby, but lots of biographies. It's this beautiful sort of tribute to the art of the written word and the spoken word to some extent. Yes, so there are stories that we can tell about the economy that are like short stories, right? They're just very crisp. They're a moment in time, and you can see the meaning in them. And then there are stories about finance as well that go on and on. And I think this is the thing that people forget about finance and money, which is that it is a narrative. It is a history, right? It is stories people tell each other, but they just use money as the way to indicate what that story is. To your point about warmth as well, because that's, I think, very important to the delivery. I wasn't really going for warmth. I was actually bored. I was in the grocery store when I was writing this. So it was more kind of like, who could possibly want something this nerdy? Let me speak to my people of geekery. But I really love Paris and France, as you know, right? Obsessed with it. And I've learned a lot from the French way of doing things. So in France, because they had a revolution, which a lot of people may or may not remember, they are very intent on preserving other people's free will, right? And so if you want to get something in France, you do not say, please do this. You cannot give a direct order. What you do say usually is, je vous propose, right? Which is, I propose to you. Right. And so if you go to a restaurant, the menu itself will say, nous vous proposons, like we propose to you steak frite or whatever. Right. And so there's always this, you have to leave space for people to say yes or no, to be themselves for that exchange. And that's very much a function of French society, not so much a function of American society, where we just sort of barrel ahead and I have this thing to say and we have a giant country in which to say it. And so I think that actually the French way, I'm going to be a little bit chauvinistic about preferring the French way, on Twitter works a lot better, which is getting people's, in radio as well, we learn this. When you're doing a difficult interview, it's important to get a contract. And I don't mean a written contract, but to ask people, is it okay if I ask you about this, right? It's a moral contract between two people.
Oh, maybe we could get out of the one-way marketing and bulldozing into conversations if we, I would say, got involved with different streams on Twitter and brought different cultures and conversation and human interaction sensibilities to the platform.
Yeah, they hugely increase our perception of the world. And so staying with this idea of France and is, I discovered French Twitter, right? So every country has its own Twitter. And I had a lot of exposure to UK Twitter because I used to, very often go to London for work, obviously worked for The Guardian as well. And so I was exposed to that, but then I discovered French Twitter, and it was this wonderful insight into the humor of the country and the political happenings and how they really saw their politicians, and it kind of really enriched how I perceived France, right, in a way that, and French people in a way that was incredibly productive. And then recently I discovered Irish Twitter, which currently I believe is actually the best Twitter. So it is, it's full of incredibly bright, incredibly what we would call salty people. And I've learned a lot of terms, like if you're sort of complaining about something, rightfully so, that's not right or fair or just, it's called giving out, which I now use in my head all the time. And so discovering those other worlds and people in other countries and, in other industries is such a hugely valuable way to use it. And it also, and I think this is really important, it doesn't always work out well, right? Like you can bust into another part of Twitter and get it completely wrong, right? Mm-hmm. Speak out of place, overstep your bounds, not get permission, not do je vous propose, and you hear about it instantly. And so it becomes a really good discipline in judging boundaries and in judging where people are, what they identify with, and where our own expression has its limits.
So, or as I like to say, sort of the best networking you can do often is with your ears and your eyes, not your mouth. And so the idea of, I think the undervalued use of something like Twitter is the observation and the learning. And so many people just rush in to share their 2 cents. So when you say you found...
To be clear, I am definitely one of those people. I have a lot of 2 cents.
But you know what? You've been on there since 2009. I figure you're allowed to have your 2 cents. But when you say you found French Twitter and UK Twitter, is this because of lists? Is this because of time zones? Is this because of, there's some interesting people, and they're French or they're Irish or they're British, and who are they following? And let me see what the conversations they're having in that little niche. Is that how you have found these other sort of Twitters, so people don't think there's some other URL they have to go to.
Oh, yeah, no, they're not. It's all on the same website. So it's all on one Twitter. It is just that people organize themselves by communities, right? And so they're like little villages. So the way that you, I think, can best understand it is that, I started out on finance Twitter, fully on finance Twitter, one of the first people on it. There were maybe 30 of us who were just constantly talking to each other. And then the financial crisis came, so that kept us really busy. And so they would follow other people that they knew, either geographically in their spaces or who were in industry they had grown up with or in industries that they knew. And so the way that I discovered French Twitter actually was through finance Twitter. It was French people who were in finance and who were following me because I was tweeting economics and business news and Wall Street news, and they wanted to keep up on that. And then we sort of drifted off into talking about Paris and history and Baudelaire and all that kind of stuff. And so it's usually, if you curate the people that you're following very well, which I have to work at, I end up with just huge Twitter crushes on everybody, and I'm following like 4,000 people, and I can never unfollow. It's very difficult for me to unfollow people because I'm like, oh, but they said that funny thing once, and what if they say another funny thing and then I miss it?
I'm not there to see it.
Yeah, I'm like fully invested. It's very difficult for me to uninvest from some people. And so what happens is they bring in their own knowledge, their own networks, the people around them, and then you get more exposure. And what I use, there's a function called Twitter lists where you can put different accounts on a list, and then you can, just follow them. So I have an Ireland list, I have a France list, I have a UK list, I have an Egypt list, I have a Japan list. All of these are different geographical areas, and then you have industries and disciplines. So my favorite Twitter list is historians, because they always have something salty to say about, I don't know, Leopold of Belgium, or, how, Marie Antoinette is overrated, which she is, FYI. And so that's also a kind of an escape. And of course, there are the cute animals, right? So you always get the visual break of, puppies and kittens, which I'm, again, very invested in. I will never unfollow an animal account of any kind.
But as you and I joked the other day, as I sort of tease, I do have this kind of, I'm going to say my dark humor and not following anyone, but like the tweet of God, only following one person. And for anyone who doesn't follow the tweet of God account on Twitter, God only follows Justin Bieber. So there we go.
That's bless Justin Bieber.
Bless Justin Bieber.
He has been blessed on Twitter.
He's been blessed by the tweet of God. So much of that platform, how it's become used, has because of the users, not the platform telling us what to do. So you think about hashtags evolved as a way for us as users to have a filing system and to locate information. That wasn't like Twitter said, hey, use hashtags so people can find your information. So some of the stuff with trolls, unfortunately, is really incumbent upon the users to deal with. So with sort of exiting a bad guest from a party, as all good networkers have to do at times, talk about how people should be dealing with trolls.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think this also comes back to the proprioception as well, right? Which is understanding when somebody is in your space in a way that they shouldn't be, right? And that's where the trolling comes from. So one of the sort of persistent problems on social media platforms, and I actually think this is why it's really useful to remember that social media is something that you can log out of, and that you can close, and that you don't have to live within, because it can often be, for people who aren't used to any kind of public-facing role or speaking, it can be harrowing if they are the subject of what's called a swarm or a pylon. And what that is basically is a denial of service attack of sorts, right? So let's say you say something, somebody doesn't like it, they invite thousands of their friends or a bot network, if it's usually about politics, and they come into your mentions, and it just crowds out your ability to respond to anything. And very often the messages that they're sending you are pretty bleak, right? And they're pretty harassing messages. And so again, for people who aren't used to negotiating public spaces and having that, proprioception of here's the space that's mine, and here's how I hold my space, and here's how I'm safe, that can be very, very distracting. So it happens to every woman, especially who has a prominent voice or a prominent following. That's been going on for 6,000 years. At least we're not burned at the stake anymore, so we have that going for us. But it does feel physically violent. It is an emotional violence, right, when you see that. And so I think at that point where it's really, really good to start thinking about Twitter and, Facebook, Instagram, wherever this might happen, as a social media platform and a specific technology, is that when we use social media, even though it seems infinite and endless because we all see each other's faces and to some extent recognize each other's humanity, we only have 4 or 5 limited ways to communicate with each other, right? You can send out a tweet, you can send out a retweet, you can send out a DM, you can do a quote tweet. So it's literally 4 or 5 ways that you can communicate with another person. On Instagram, you can post a picture, or you can reply to a picture. And we forget how limited that is. And so because it's so limited, or rather it is so limited because that has algorithmic importance, right? You can control an algorithm better if you have fewer variables for people to interact. And so I started to look into pile-ons and swarms because I was seeing a lot of it, not so much for myself, although it does happen occasionally, but I was seeing it happen to women every day, especially other women journalists. And I was wondering what the mechanism was. Like, there had to be a mechanism, an algorithmic mechanism for this to happen. And so, I found out about the way that botnets are run by marketing firms specifically to advocate for certain people or certain causes, whether on the right or the left or whatever it is. And so it comes from a place, right? So it can feel when you're in it like a hurricane, right? Like a chaotic creation of nature, right? But it actually comes from a specific place for a specific interest to stop the person who is tweeting from talking. It's a silencing tool, right? And so the way to do it, first of all, is there's a thing on Twitter where you lock your account, and so then people can't pick up your tweets. So that helps protect your space, right? So it's just like in a dinner party, right? You protect your space. You turn your back on the person or you walk away, right? So you lock
Change
your
account. Seats, do whatever. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Right? You just physically disengage. It doesn't have to be like a big fight. You can choose to have a big fight, and very often I like to be very clear about what boundaries are. I think it's very helpful to people, and I don't mind saying, no, you crossed a line and here's why, and here's 25 tweets about it. I don't mind. But some people do. And then, if you feel the need, if somebody is being harassing, you would block them in the same way that you would disinvite them from a party or a house or whatever. They're in your space in a way that is ugly and in a way that is, harassing. And so you can just block them. There are other tools as well, muting and so on. But the important thing is to always remember that disengagement is an option. Right. And so you don't have to take on the energy that other people are bringing to you. You can hold your space online as in person in networking. Right. So we've all been in networking events where someone has said something inappropriate to us. Right. What do? You can, if you're particularly clever, you can come back with a witty comeback, or you can walk away. Right. And it's very similar online. I think we do have to take that discipline into it.
I love that, and I think the sort of one of those things you want to say to people: become familiar with the privacy tools, and it doesn't mean you have to completely shut down who gets to follow you, but not enabling people to retweet you, to only be able to see in your mentions verified or real accounts. So there are those ways to do that, to create that more pleasant space. And then, there's the smart move, which is to kind of look who's making the comments. And if the account has a lot of numbers in it and a stock photo, chances are it's not a real account, and not responding to it and just blocking them is the best tactic.
Exactly. It really teaches you who's worth engaging with, right? I mean, with enough time, you really get a practice in how even a sentence gives away where somebody is going with an argument. And that's just incredibly useful. And, in the meme language of the day, that's their problem. That's a you problem, as they say online, right? That's not a me problem, or it's not our problem, right? If somebody is losing their composure online, that's something they have to deal with, and I wish them well. Right. But it's not something that I necessarily need to feed with more fire or more energy.
Right. I'll find another place in the room. Mm-hmm. Just like in a bar or a cocktail party, I can walk away. Yeah. I can look over and say, I make sure that I don't stand out of the earshot and eye shot of that person because I don't want to engage in a conversation with them. And
exactly. Puppies are a click away. Like, why would you not choose the puppy option? in that scenario.
Well, if there was a kitten picture, I'd be choosing that before the puppy option, but I know where you're going on
That's
that.
the only debate. Exactly. Which tiny furry animal? Yeah.
Where can we get our distractions, and where can we, I would say find our joy and our humor and bring that humanity out. But speaking on this, you use Instagram in terms of sharing of information and following much different than you do Twitter in terms of community and how you're engaging.
Oh, yeah.
Was there thought, strategy behind that, or just happened?
No, I think it just happened. I mean, I really don't have a strategy. Other people do, so I have a lot of respect for that. They have, they tweet at certain times a day. They look at their Twitter metrics. They look at their Instagram metrics. I don't really do that in my personal life because it's a lot of what's involved in journalism itself, right? Which is constantly gauging the audience, and also in finance specifically, right? You're always thinking about how people are responding, who's reading articles about certain subjects. So in my personal usage, I don't really do that. I use Instagram for travel, for pictures, for friends, occasionally for meditative rants about my favorite coffee. Like it's, it just seems like it's a nice place. I think you have to have at least one place online if you're very online, which a lot of professionals are, right? Even aside from all of our expertise, our full lives that are not lived on computers or smartphones, the time that we spend online, we have to have a refuge there, right? And you have to choose your refuge. So I do use Instagram as my refuge. It's cute animals, it's friends, babies, it's travels, it's, Paris or LA or wherever I happen to be. Both of us travel a lot, so we have a lot of pictures to give to people. And it trains your observational sense, right? It's very nice, especially if you're in a world of words, to just deal with pictures. It just cuts through a lot of clutter. And I find that beautiful. And I think it also makes you appreciate how a lot of people have a really good eye and a really great sense of humor. Like captions are just a wonderful way to communicate. So, yeah, that's why I use it.
I love that. And often enough, I find now, though, I leave the phone not behind, because heaven forbid ever do that, but it stays in the pocket or it stays in the pocketbook because I want to have a better time than my phone whether it's on the trip or at the party.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your energy has to be present, right? I mean, this is my current kick, actually, which is I'm actually on a Twitter break because I want to, just really reconnect with the people that I know in real life. There's a different energy to being present. And I think no matter how good you are online or at social media, there's another concept that I find very compelling, and it's called parasocial relationships, right? And it used to apply mostly to celebrities. A parasocial relationship is a unidirectional one, right? So you have a relationship with the person's image, right? So you're seeing pictures of them, you're seeing videos of them, and you feel like you know them and that you can relate to them. Right? And that used to be limited to celebrities. That's why we have celebrity journalism. But now I think my theory is we all have parasocial relationships to each other, right? Like we all see each other's images and videos, and we're interacting with that curated form of them more often, most of the time, than we're interacting with their true presence, right? And there is a lot to be said about just the sheer human moment of connection, of reading body language, of eye contact, of waiting and pausing, not just typing things into a little phone to ghosts you can't see, right? And so I think that if we take that as a cautionary tale, the idea that we don't want to get into parasocial relationships with the people that we actually know, then it reminds us that it is very valuable to be present and to bring the full force of our focus and understanding. We learn from each other. I mean, I used to be, and I'm sure you were too, because we were brought up in this world where individualism was the highest and the best good, right? An North American world, and also the world of finance. But increasingly, I think, and this is also, I want to credit NBC's TV show The Good Place here. That's not a sponsored thing. It's just my favorite and one of my favorite TV shows. But, it's the core question of that show, even though it's a hilarious comedy, is what do we owe to each other? And increasingly, I think we are all each other's only salvation. I don't think you can come up with any answer, as the medieval philosophers used to say, a priori, right? Like just, before you deal with any other person, right? Like before you think or interact. I think you can only come up with an answer from other people. I think, and currently the very challenging political situation across the entire globe, I think is designed to teach us that uniting with each other, a sense of unity and connection, is the only way we're ever going to change things, right? And so I think in a way that individualism is not being broken down, but is becoming more nuanced. And if we're going to be thinking ahead about how we have to be, it is going to be about connecting with each other in a very authentic and real and unmediated way. And that means being present in person. But even if you decide to be mostly online, because that's a tool open to us, I've taken a lot of inspiration from Gen Z, right, Zoomers, that when they talk about how they're feeling online, they're not pretending to feel good, right? Which for Gen X, for boomers, even for Xennials, which is the Oregon Trail generation, and millennials, is an alien thought, right? We've all been taught if somebody says, "How are you?" "Oh, I'm fine," right? But Gen Z won't say that. Very often they'll say, "I'm feeling sad," or or they'll be very funny about it. There's kind of a nihilism about feeling sad, like we're all feeling sad, and they think it's ridiculous to pretend otherwise. And I take a lot of faith in that, because we can only really connect with each other if we show our true faces, right? And that can be our true physical faces or our true online faces, but it really has to be about coming together. I don't think that there is a future for true individualism anymore. And I think that's the energy that we have to take into relating to other people. That's my own theory.
I like
People
that.
might disagree,
But
the entire Republican Party would disagree.
I like that theory.
Yeah.
No, it's an interesting transformational time, and I think this conversation is such a amazing reminder that this tool can be used in complex and nuanced ways, just like our human relationships, and that people shouldn't be afraid of sharing. I want to say, like I said, making big ideas accessible, inviting more people into that conversation, because that's one of the things I've always loved about Twitter, is sort of this democratization of access. The closed doors, the networking groups, the elite parties we weren't invited to, we can all, on the basis of how we exchange, come into those parties, and how you use it is such a reminder of that, and also a reminder of when it's okay to walk away, and for all of us to get away from that fear of, not showing up every day. You can show up every day, but show up as yourself. But you can also say, you know what, I need to be present here. I need to walk away.
Mm-hmm. We need our own spaces, right? I mean, and again, I keep coming back to this idea of physical movement, right, as a metaphor for online movement. But one of the best pieces of advice, there's a life coach named Martha Beck who I really like, and she's a Harvard-trained sociologist, but she looks like a tiny elfin person from the Fae realm. She has this tremendous energy, and and once I asked her, because one of the things that we run into in group spaces is, what do you do with people who are trying to drain your energy? And it may not even be intentional, but just some people run on eliciting certain reactions from others, right? And so it's attention, and very often some people don't care whether it's negative attention, right? And that can feel draining. And so I asked her, what do you do, especially if you're sort of a generous person or a giving person, a person who reaches out to others? What do you do when you feel that people are draining you, when you have emotional vampires around you? And she said, well, number one, you learn to hold your space, right? You literally hold a physical space around yourself. You just picture it as almost like a bubble, and it gives you just some room to clarify, right? People will literally step back if you do this. But the other thing is, if you don't give them the reaction that they're looking for, they'll just move on to somebody else, right? And I think that's important, because what it means is that we can curate our experience of the world, right? If we're used to responding to everything, and with smartphones and so on, that's become even more concentrated. You respond to every email. I don't, but I've heard people do. It is done in some circles, but they respond to every email, they respond to every text. We feel this weight of response, right? This to-do list of people we haven't gotten back to, and I think it's really intriguing, and this is something I'm playing with right now, which is, what if you only respond to the things you like, right? And so you only create a reciprocal response from people and things that you like, and you literally just ignore everything else. Like if somebody's rude, just ignore them. Don't deal with them, mute them, block them, whatever. But don't even give it that energy. And then you can essentially create a situation where a lot more of your life is what you want it to be, as opposed to being backed into a corner by demands from other people, which I think a lot of us feel, overwhelmed. So overwhelm is also a big issue, whether you're present in person or online or with networking, right? Some situations can be really intimidating. And I think one way of dealing with overwhelm is to be a curator, is to exclude. In a way that's not snobby. To your point, you made a really good point about the democratization of online spaces. And so I think one of the things that has been very lucky for me about social media is that I had a fully baked career before Twitter was even created, right? I had already risen. Granted, I rose young, but I was a bureau chief at that point. I had been an editor at that point. I had been in leadership positions. So when Twitter came, I didn't have to use it to build my name. Right? And which a lot of people do. They feel, I have to be online, like it's this hair shirt that you have to wear, right? Which is completely counterproductive. And when I got into journalism, it was a very hierarchical, very strict world, and where status was definitional to where people's careers went. So, there was an old saying in Boston, which had, of course, a very strict social code, that the Cabots speak only to the lodges and the lodges speak only to God. Right, about these two famous families, the Cabots and the Lodges, that were so far above society that no one else could engage with them. And so when I got into journalism, it was very similar. It was like the New York Times people spoke to Wall Street Journal people, and they spoke only to God. Right, like there was, there wasn't this democratization of media where somebody who worked at a major national paper, which, by the way, you had to be 40 years old to even begin to enter, could ever talk to somebody who, say, worked at a trade paper. It just wasn't done. And Twitter flipped all of that upside down, and I love it. Like, now you see 26-year-old writers for the New York Times. I love it. It always should have been like that, right? And so, because what it did was it allowed journalists and it allowed editors to see each other's thoughts without the bias of, this person doesn't have certain resume benchmarks or whatever.
It's your accomplishments. It's, do you bring an interesting conversation to the table? Do you care and listen to other people? Because I think, back on Twitter back in 2009, that's the way I've thought about it. And the more that we can get back to that, and hopefully from listening to this conversation, people think more of it as that physical space, and how do people make me feel? And importantly, how do I make other people feel? And if we can engage more that way, we can bring it back to that, I'm not going to say that beautiful place, but that good place that it can be. So much more to talk about, but I'll get you back on the podcast for that. But thank you for sharing so much on trolls and who gets to talk to God and inverted yield curve and just all your extraordinary ideas. Thank you.
Truly my pleasure. Always wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to Build Your Dream Network. Stay connected and don't miss a networking insight by subscribing to the podcast. And while you're there, I'd love you to rate and review the show too. Are you looking for more networking advice? Pick up a copy of my book, Build Your Dream Network. It's your guide to modern networking. I'd like to hear your networking questions, tips, and ideas. Connect with me via my website, jkellyhoey.co. You'll find links to all my social media accounts, plus a contact form to email me your questions. I'm Kelly Hoey, and I'll be back again next week to tackle your networking challenges.